Story 1. Statistics. I particularly detested factorization. I had no understanding of how one algebraic expression was meant to translate to the answer. It just seemed nonsensical. Story 2. How ironic it is that the first two comments were, and still are, absolutely my favorite subjects, math and physics. Story 3. For the most part, I still feel there are many ways to interpret literature, and it seems wrong to be taught a single correct interpretation. Story 4. I struggled with math but excelled in every other subject. I performed well in history, creative writing, literature, keyboarding, and science. I worked as a teacher's aide and a library aide, helping other students with their essays. Despite my difficulties in math, multiple teachers informed me that I had no future in a meaningful career and doubted my ability to graduate from high school. I did graduate and spent nearly a decade in social media. Now, I earn more money in warehouse security than a teacher does. Story 5. I disliked English. My main issue is why every story must have a deeper meaning that we assume the author intended to convey. It seems pretentious to believe that the accepted interpretation of a story is the only truth. Story 6. Art is talent-based, in my opinion, and I lacked any talent. I didn't and still don't understand what benefit I gained from being criticized for not drawing or painting as the teacher wanted. For kids with artistic tendencies, I'm sure it was great. But why couldn't I have chosen something that would be more beneficial for me? Story 7. At my school, after 7th grade, English basically became reading. I couldn't tell you how many times I've read To Kill a Mockingbird. Every year, my teacher for 3 years of high school was the same one I had in 8th grade, and he never taught anything. He just gave us books to read. Story 8. Algebra. I can add, subtract, multiply, and divide whole numbers and fractions. However, once letters are included in a mathematical equation, it becomes completely foreign to me. Story 9. Mathematics is essential, as I was often told that I would need it as I got older. I have been in software engineering for a decade. While basic math is necessary, not much else is required. I was also informed that I would need to use scripting. However, aside from my signature, no one challenges the numbers I write, so it's not a necessity. I can still write in that format, though. Story 10. Math. I always knew we would end up using calculators, and it turns out I was right. Who is the clever one now? A group of people wasting my time. Story 11. Biology, but only because we had one science teacher who was a narcissist and treated it like an open mic night. Story 12. It felt like you had to think and generate ideas, but there are right thoughts and ideas which made it a struggle. Additionally, it was the first subject where the teacher truly made a difference. I struggled at first, but Mr. Stone showed me that I could learn English through film, and I subsequently passed higher English. I still hate it. Story 13. Geography. I found it boring and somewhat chaotic because it touched on many other subjects beyond just the study of countries. It included elements of chemistry and geology when discussing resources, as well as the history of those countries. Overall, it felt disorganized, at least in my school. Story 14. I hated the books we were forced to read and despised how they taught writing. I could never achieve better than a C+. We read safe, boring books and wrote compositions in a stilted academic manner, with no creativity whatsoever. If you made any mistake on your in-class composition, a misspelling or a comma in the wrong place, it was an automatic failing grade. It was literally the most counterproductive way to teach writing you can imagine. The irony? I was a voracious reader. I just preferred books that were more adventurous, not the innocuous material they forced upon us. Once, I had Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas out at the lunch table, and my English teacher had me surrender the book to the assistant principal. Strangely enough, I became an English major in college and eventually became a writer. A freshman professor recognized potential in me and encouraged me to take additional classes. I will never forgive my 4 high school English teachers for making me detest the English language. Story 15. Diagramming sentences, verbs, conjugations, prepositional phrases, and exceptions that lack logical sense can be frustrating. Story 16. English was the only subject in which I received a C. I didn't dislike it, but it was the one I had to apply myself to a bit more. I loved math. Story 17, Trigonometry. To this day, I still dislike a lot of it. The majority of the content involved memorizing many identities and formulas that look almost identical at first glance. This made it much more difficult for me to remember, especially due to having untreated attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Story 18. In fourth grade, they thought I was excelling in my geometry class, so they switched me to algebra honors halfway through the semester. I was suddenly thrust from basic addition and subtraction with known numbers, 360 degrees, 120 degrees, 90 degrees, etc., to multiplication and division with letters, missing everything in between. I failed miserably. The next year, they placed me in regular algebra, but again without the foundational geometry, leaving me short on essential knowledge. Once more, I failed miserably. This pattern continued with all my math classes. They'd place me in algebra, then algebra 2, then pre-calculus without allowing me to master the fundamentals. Each time, I was moved out mid-semester, skipping crucial material. I graduated without ever passing algebra 2. Story 19, Physical education, known as gym class in America, absolutely frustrates me. The teachers have favorites, the lessons are difficult, and you have to change clothes with other students. It is an unpleasant subject. This is a stance I am willing to support. Story 20. English is my second language, followed by French as my third language. It's hard to accept this nowadays, but the past is in the past. Looking back, I realize I made mistakes. Learning languages is a good investment, and they are not too difficult to master. Story 21. Literature. It took me a while after high school to start reading for pleasure again. There was an episode of a popular animated series where the doctor screened the students by reading The Great Gatsby and quizzed them on it. They all failed because it was so boring. I had the same exact question on a test. It was a sleek, speedy Bonneville. I swear they included it specifically because the study guides don't mention it. The selection of reading material, the pace set to complete it, and the arbitrary breakdown made it a chore. And don't get me started on Shakespeare. That work should be viewed, not read. Story 22. I was an art and literature kid. I disliked physical education. I was a good runner, but I would deliberately lose races near the finish line to avoid participating in district or regional competitions. I was too self-conscious to give drama any real effort. Thankfully, I only had to take it in year 7. Story 23. Sports, or as we call it in the UK, physical education, is something I haven't been particularly involved in. I have never considered myself sporty or inclined towards team activities, as I have always been quite shy. Story 24. I saw no use for algebra at that time and have had no practical use for it during the 60 years that have passed since then. Story 25. I disliked any subject that required learning. My memory was not very good, so I struggled with subjects like biology and history. Story 26. Geometry or any mathematics beyond basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. Story 27. My math teachers had no interest in helping me. I had 2 long-term substitutes in high school. One teacher who openly flirted with football players, and another who constantly said to ask a friend for help. This severely hindered me from doing anything beyond basic algebra. Story 28. Information technology. I used to absolutely dislike it. I literally couldn't sleep the night before because of it. Then I realized it wasn't graded. I could just sit there and do nothing for the whole lesson with no repercussions. Although I still couldn't tell you what the 3 buttons on a standard mouse do. Story 29. Practical research was challenging for me. Although the lessons were straightforward, conducting the actual research with uncooperative group members was quite frustrating. Story 30. German. Not because of the language, I was good at it and loved learning it. It was the teacher. That man expected us to be nearly fluent and would be upset when we knew more than we were supposed to. Story 31. I enjoyed history and English. Other than that, school felt like torture. Story 32. Mathematics and physics. I deliberately chose the experimental humanities curriculum with additional mathematics and physics classes because I enjoyed those subjects as well. Unfortunately, the teacher, despite being a genius, was not well suited for high school, and the entire class struggled throughout the duration of the course. I received a few B grades early on while I could rely on my middle school knowledge, but then my performance declined quickly. I tried to get private lessons and received positive feedback from the private instructor, only to return home with a C grade. So, I decided to stop caring and went through the motions for the rest of the years. Story 33. Computer Programming. I took it as a filler class when I was signing up for classes in high school, and I disliked it. I've never had a class that felt more like work. Story 34. I had two really bad music teachers in a row. I couldn't drop the subject quickly enough when it came to choosing my general certificate of secondary education subjects. Story 35. Definitely the gym. I understand that exercise is important, but the overly competitive individuals who will tackle you to get the ball, even when they are on the same team, ruin everything. We were also graded on completing the mile, sit-ups, and push-ups, but we weren't taught the proper techniques in class. It made no sense to me. Story 36. I didn't hate subjects. I hated the teachers. I loved chemistry in middle school, but in high school it was dreadful. Both teachers were horrible, and I never learned anything. I love art, but I hated it in middle school because that teacher just read Poe and didn't teach anything to the class. History, math, and physics were similarly uninspiring. Story 37. Most math, except for geometry and trigonometry, was much easier for me to understand because I could see what was happening. Story 38. Math has always been my favorite subject, with history being a close second. I have had good instructors in both and performed much better in those subjects in college, but the trauma runs deep, and I still struggle with those concepts. Story 39. I was good at mathematics until I reached calculus. Even when I took it again in college, I couldn't understand it. I think part of the issue was because my high school teacher was not effective at teaching the subject, even though he was a really nice person. I'm very glad I don't have to struggle to learn it again. Story 40. I disliked biology because the course tried to condense the essential concepts into a single year for someone who knew nothing about the subject. None of it had any meaning to me. It took years to gain an understanding. Story 41. Health, mainly the physical education portion. There are either random, incomplete units on very obscure sports or complaints from boys about how girls have lower thresholds on the presidential fitness tests. Story 42. Chemistry has been challenging for me due to my dyscalculia and dyslexia. It has been a struggle to keep everything organized. I much preferred earth sciences and biology, but chemistry felt boring and tedious. We didn't even conduct any interesting experiments. Story 43. Physical education has always been important to me. I have remained physically active throughout my life, but I did not appreciate being pressured to play team sports that I had no interest in. Story 44. Math class in elementary school was the only subject in which I consistently struggled. Things improved for me when I had excellent teachers in algebra, geometry, and calculus in high school. Now I work in finance. Story 45. Religion. I was required to attend a Catholic high school, where religion was mandatory from grades 7 to 12. The classes felt biased and manipulative. I found them unproductive. Story 46. I used to love math. It was my favorite subject until I took Algebra 2, where I struggled with the formulas. This affected my passion for the subject. Story 47. I was sick and missed a lot of school in the 3rd and 4th grades. I fell behind in the curriculum and never fully caught up. I struggled to achieve a C in high school algebra and had to hire a private tutor to earn a C in college algebra. Meanwhile, I was getting A's in my other subjects. Story 48. Chemistry. For those who say it is easy, in my country, chemistry is much more difficult and has significantly more content. Story 49. Chemistry. For those who say it's easy, in my country, chemistry is much more difficult and has significantly more content. Story 50. Social dancing can be challenging, especially when asking a group of sweaty teenagers to separate into boys and girls before selecting partners to dance with. You didn't want to appear too eager by being the first to choose one of the attractive girls, fearing they might reject you. However, if you waited until the end, You risked being picked by someone less desirable. Story 51. I would have to say algebra. I wasn't bad at math, but that teacher was not effective. I had him as a teacher 3 times because I kept failing his class. You would think they would realize he was not a good teacher for me, but they paid no attention and didn't care. I also didn't bother speaking up because I knew they wouldn't do anything about it. From all the stories I've heard at that school, someone would complain about something, and nothing would ever change. If they did take action, it was usually because someone had to exert a lot of effort to get them to do something. Story 52. Social science. Who is going to learn about deceased individuals and events that occurred before my time, along with irrelevant dates? I dislike social science. Story 53. As an adult, I love to read and enjoy learning history. I particularly enjoy learning new languages and practicing them with native speakers. My teachers made English, history, and foreign languages extremely boring, and the people I remember as being good at those subjects are not readers, not interested in history, and speak only one language. So, I guess ultimately loving a subject and studying it are 2 very different things. Story 54. Native language and all its grammar rules, writing essays, and studying poetry can be overwhelming. Story 55. English evolved from understanding grammar and exploring literature to catering to teachers' opinions. If you did not conform, you would not receive high marks. Story 56. Although I enjoyed math, I disliked trigonometry. It may have been because the teacher presented it as a collection of numbers, and I do not appreciate math solely for the numbers. I struggled with it so much that when I went to university, I decided to take a remedial class, which turned out to focus on unit circle trigonometry. In that class, I learned a lot of theory and really grew to love it. Story 57. My teacher was really lazy, and we rarely went outside. It was mostly bookwork and extremely repetitive. Thank God it was only a semester. It felt like more. Story 58. Geometry was a terrible experience, mainly because of the teacher. I get along just fine with math, but that woman was impossible. Story 59. During high school, there weren't any subjects to dislike. We just didn't want to be studying all day long, even on weekends. In the early days of Chavez's government, they introduced a few mandatory subjects about the army, history, and citizenship, which were quite dull. Story 60. Calculus, algebra, and geometry were fairly easy for me, but then I encountered calculus and was humbled quickly. I dropped it after a couple of months because I didn't need it to graduate. Story 61. I was always bad at mathematics and physics, but I knew they were my problem areas, so I studied extra hard for them. My biggest challenge was chemistry because I excelled in biology. However, despite the overlap between the subjects, I always had a difficult time with chemistry, which affected my aspirations of pursuing a science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field in university. Story 62. In my opinion, Polish language should be considered literature at this point. In high school, you don't learn how to use it properly anymore. You just analyze a large number of books. I wouldn't mind this too much, but our teacher assigned long opinion essays during every single lesson, graded them in a very unusual way, and her tests were almost impossible to pass. It didn't matter if I had actually read a book or not. She told me countless times that I was lazy and that I did everything incorrectly. During one mock exam, I decided to write an opinion essay the way she instructed, and I scored 7%. I couldn't attend most of her lessons due to severe depression at the time and struggled to keep up with the essays. She told me I would fail my exams, yet I scored 70%. Story 63. Chemistry. Their elemental calculations don't make sense to me. I am very good with numbers, but in this subject, math is not adding up, and it's driving me crazy. Story 64. I have always had extreme difficulty with math due to the content. As for English, every teacher I had in high school was not effective. Story 65. I enjoyed physical activities but dreaded carrying extra gear, and people were often obnoxious in the locker rooms. Math was challenging for me because I have ADHD, making it very difficult. Fortunately, I passed and even progressed to the higher levels, but I believe that if I had been on medication and didn't zone out during class, I could have performed well. The concepts are not difficult to grasp once you understand them, especially the topics from the General Certificate of Secondary Education, which I ironically came to understand better later in life. Story 66. Forensic science was boring, and I remember having many assignments to complete at home. Story 67. Physics and mathematics have always been my least favorite subjects. However, I strangely loved chemistry. It must have been the desire to experiment with reactions. Story 68. I support ensuring that children get exercise, but they tend to be overly competitive and exclusive when participating in informal sports at school. Story 69. I have a learning disability that involves mathematics. I always grew up thinking I was not capable of understanding math until I was informed in high school about my learning disability. Story 70. I dislike calculus not because I hate the subject itself, but because I had a terrible teacher for it in high school. Story 71. I hated diagramming sentences with a passion. I excelled in English and creative writing, but I just couldn't figure out how to diagram a sentence, which frustrated me, leading me to refuse to do it. I remember writing, "Who cares?" in the margin of a paper, and the teacher reported me to my mother. Story 72. I actually loved science in earlier grades, but once high school started, science became my worst enemy. I struggled with chemistry and often guessed on quiz answers, resulting in zeros. Fortunately, my teacher was understanding and didn't fail me. Thankfully, chemistry has had no relevance in my adult life, so it would have been frustrating to repeat the grade over something so irrelevant. Story 73. I had to carry a separate uniform and a pair of shoes all day, and it was always uncertain whether the long projects and assessments spanning multiple lessons would be dropped. Story 74. I later realized that I enjoyed all the subjects. It was mostly the other students and a couple of teachers who made me dislike certain classes. Story 75. Math was taught for at least 3 years in high school because the administration did not hire a new teacher, and substitutes did not remain long. Consequently, we were left with a former physical education teacher who struggled with the subject and had less understanding than 95% of the class. Story 76. Physics. I cried during my final year of high school. I had no business being in that class. I wanted to enjoy it. I find physics fascinating even though I feel lost. I've read works by Michio Kaku and Carlo Rovelli, but I still feel overwhelmed. Story 77. I disliked literature. I always found it boring and unhelpful, especially the literature of my country. I resented the fact that, since our education system is based on humanism, we studied mostly English literature, German literature, and similar subjects, rather than more practical subjects and the cultures of those countries. I learned English at home thanks to the internet, which resulted in my being much more proficient than my classmates, who were overwhelmed with medieval literature and unnecessary grammar rules. This is why many people in my country lack English proficiency. They are taught improperly. Even many English teachers do not speak English fluently and make numerous mistakes. The only times I enjoyed literature were when it focused on ancient Greek literature, Dante, and works like Harry Potter and The Lord of the Rings. Story 78. English has always been challenging for me. Whether it was due to my own speaking difficulties or the inability to connect with certain teachers, it was consistently my weakest subject. I have struggled with remembering information and have learned best through using knowledge in real-life situations. Unfortunately, most of my teachers employed similar teaching methods, expecting every student to learn in one specific way. When I reached college, I finally understood what book reviews should entail. I didn't dislike reading. I just had trouble grasping themes and other elements of storytelling. For some reason, when I read, my mind was often too focused on identifying these aspects instead of allowing the story to resonate with me. Story 79. For 6 consecutive years, from 5th grade arithmetic through high school geometry, I failed my math courses and had to retake them all in summer school. I also disliked physical education. Story 80. My sophomore Spanish class. I have nothing against Spanish class in general, but the teacher I had for that class was unkind and did not effectively teach. I do not remember anything from her class. Story 81. I was fortunate in high school. The year I started was the last year. French was not compulsory, and I disliked taking it in grade school. Coincidentally, it was also the first year computer programming was taught in schools in Ontario, possibly in all of Canada. I loved that class. My least favorite class in high school was geography, not because I disliked the subject, but because of the way it was taught. That class was not enjoyable. Story 82, Physical Education. I don't like sports, so it was the worst thing in the world for me, especially since sometimes the teachers would still make you do physical education outside, even if it was raining, and you would end up with a terrible cold the next day. Story 83. Definitely, it didn't feel like a viable use of my time, except on ping pong days. I always have time for ping pong. Story 84. Conjugating grammar in a different way did not make sense to me. I struggled for years because it was required and made little progress. The funny thing is that I decided to attend immersion language schools in Latin America, followed by a year of college in Peru, and finally became fluent. I often wish I could meet with my old high school Spanish teachers to show them that their worst student actually succeeded. Story 85. Reading the comments, it is clear the problem is that many teachers or guidelines never explain the goals or methods of each subject. For every subject, it should be taught, this is how we model things, here are the methods, and the transferable skills you are gaining are these. High school students are smart enough to understand that. Story 86. I was happy when it was no longer mandatory, but as an adult, I wish I had continued with it. Story 87. Art, such as drawing and music, was something I disliked. I especially hated assignments that required drawing, like flags. One subject involved handcrafting with wood, and my sister mostly handled that for me. I also never enjoyed writing essays. My sister used to write my essay assignments. School was challenging, and I am relieved to be done with it. Story 88. Anything related to rote memorization never appealed to me. I felt I could study and memorize information for a test, but my retention of that knowledge was incredibly low. History seemed much more interesting when I could hear the stories rather than just memorizing dates of events. Story 89. I disliked English because of the inadequate way it was taught. When my classmates graduated, many were still struggling with the language. Story 90. I eventually came around, but at the time I was really annoyed by many aspects of it. Why can't the object just be an object? Story 91. I switched schools 3 times between middle school and high school. From 7th grade onward, I had health class every year. I passed each year, but they continued to put me in health class. I have seen the baby birth videos and Supersize Me too many times. Story 92. I didn't care about sports and I didn't play. Everyone hated me and I hated them. It would have been better to offer different activities like yoga or Tai Chi, rather than insisting that you had to be good at something in order to participate. I had my period every time swimming season came around. In reality, I didn't have a swimsuit and wouldn't have worn one around those people if I did. So I skipped the rest of the season. Story 93. I am in high school, and physical education is my least favorite subject, followed closely by mathematics. Last week, I received a low score in mathematics and have been moved down a class. Story 94. Physics. At that time, to learn physics effectively, I previewed the material before class and reviewed it afterward. I spent almost the entire day studying physics. It was not until the final exam results were released, and I received only 20 points out of 100, that I realized I had no aptitude for learning physics. Story 95. English. Not because of the subject matter, but because I have terrible handwriting, and I was docked a good number of points for it. The moment I was allowed to type my submissions and print them out, I improved from a D average to an A. Story 96. Mathematics, particularly trigonometry, has not been necessary for me beyond basic addition and subtraction since I last took a math course in 2016. Story 97. Writing has been an interesting journey for me. In 1st grade, I broke my wrist and had to learn to write with my left hand. The reprimands I received from teachers still make me flinch today. It's funny to think that now I am an engineer, so my handwriting is quite neat. However, the arthritis I experience from those childhood incidents is quite painful. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.